Simplify your watercolor cards and projects by painting with a limited color palette. Hey guys, it's Amber. Welcome to another Color Connection episode where I use the color palette from the Altenew Inspiration Challenge to inspire my projects. I have a piece of watercolor paper trimmed to 3 inches by 6 inches, which is a mini slimline size, and I have the Altenew Artist Watercolor 24 pan set. I also have the Altenew Woodless watercolor pencil set, and I've picked out Ultramarine, which is a dark blue, and I'm going to draw my horizon line with this. This is a perfect thing to do with a watercolor pencil because it's going to melt right into the rest of the watercolor painting. It's not like using a pencil or a graphite pencil where it's going to get trapped underneath the watercolor. So I have a flat brush here, and I'm going to kind of sketch in my sandy beach. So I want it to kind of go on a diagonal versus just straight with the horizon line to add a little more interest and movement to the piece. And so I'm just going to fill that in on a diagonal with clean, clear water. Then I'm going to use the 2 browns in the set here. So there's kind of like a more like a yellow ochre. That's the Golden Harvest, I believe. And then Coffee Break is the darker brown. So I'm just going to mix those up a little bit, and I'm totally okay if it mixes with the other colors on my palette, but if you don't like your colors to mix, you can definitely clean your palette in between your mixing area and just wipe that off with a baby wipe so that you don't have contamination, but it doesn't bother me too much. So I'm just going to drop that color in, and I'm going to add a little bit of the darker brown so that we get some variation. And I'm just doing a wet on wet technique here. My watercolor paper is moving around a bit, and if you want it to stick to the surface a little bit better, you can either tape it down or you can spritz the back of the surface on your glass mat with a little bit of water, and that'll hold it down onto the surface. That'll actually help also and prevent it from kind of the edges curling up while you're painting. So I'm just dropping in both of these browns, and then I'm going to move on to the sky. I want to let the sand dry completely before I go ahead and do the ocean. So I'm going to switch over to the sky because it doesn't touch the sand at all. So again, I'm adding a whole bunch of water, less water at the horizon line, more water at the top of the page because I want the blue sky to fade off to white at the top of the card. There's 4 blues in this palette, and I'm going to use all of them. So it's Deep Blue Seas, Starry Night, Lapis Lazuli, and Crystal Water. I'm also going to add some Cool Summer Night. I think I also add a bit of Seashore to the ocean once I do that. So same thing with the sky. I'm just going to drop this in with a wet on wet technique, and as I continue up the page, I'm kind of running out of the pigment on my brush, which means that the pigment's going to get lighter and lighter as I go up the page. If you also remember that I put more water, clean, clear water, at the top, which is now the bottom based on how I have it here. But at the top of the card, I had more water, so that's going to help dilute the pigment that's on the brush as well. So it's an easy way to get your sky to just blend out to white if that's the look that you're going for. So now we're turning it top side up again, and I'm going to completely dry the card panel with a heat tool. If you have a heat tool with a dual setting, I highly recommend that you use the lower setting, and that will help to reduce any curling of your paper. So now that my sand is dry, my sky is dry, now I can come in with my ocean without it mixing. It's not, the colors aren't going to bleed and mix together, and that'll retain that sharp line that I want at my horizon. I don't want the sky and the ocean to blend into one big blob. I want a sharp line there. So I have to be honest, when I first saw this color palette, I cringed. I was like, oh man, because I don't do brown, you guys. Brown is just not my color, and there was like almost kind of like 2 brownish colors in this color palette, so I was a little bit worried, but I love how the limited color palette turned out. If you guys are enjoying this project and you're learning something new, be sure to give it a like and subscribe down below. And this is a great project to do if you're new to watercolor, if you just kind of want to practice with your brushes, practice with a wet on wet technique. Because it's very loose and there isn't really a right or wrong to it, it's a great project to kind of practice and get to know your watercolors and your brushes and your paper and how those all work together without it being too stressful. You're not necessarily coloring flowers or anything super realistic, so it's kind of a nice project to do. I want to make sure that there's different values of blue in the ocean. So far back at the horizon line, I'm going to make sure that the ocean is very dark back there. To do that, I'll pick the watercolor straight out of the pan so that it's nice and thick and super pigmented, and I'll bring that straight to the project. And then I want to dot a little bit of that darker color down further into the ocean. You can also see that I've left some white space, and that's going to help to kind of denote some waves and the crest of the waves, that white frothy part. So I felt like it is very blue. I wanted to add a little bit of a blue-green to it just for some color variance. So I'm mixing seashore with the blue that I already have, and I'll just drop that into a couple places. I don't do a lot with the seashore, so there's not a huge difference. So if you like more of a blue or green, you could add more of that. So I'm going to clean off my brush now, and I want to make sure that I have a soft line of water that comes out over the sand. So my brush is clean, it doesn't have any watercolor on it, and what I'm going to do is touch the edge of the blue ocean that I already have down that extends over the sand, and I'm just going to draw that out over the sand. That's going to make it look like there's very thin water that's come up on the shore and gone back out into the ocean. So you're basically just glazing the blue watercolor over top of the sand there. I think it looks nice when you soften that edge, that leading edge of the ocean out onto the sand as well. So it gives it a nice look. I posted another watercolor beach scene card on my own YouTube channel over at Notable Ink, and so you can check that out as well. It was very similar. It was an A2 size card, so it was a little bit different, but very similar and kind of the same technique. This card came out much more pigmented and a little bit brighter though. So if you want a softer look, check out that video. I didn't love the proportions of this card and specifically where I put the horizon line. So I'm going to tear a little bit of the top of the card off. And what I'm going to do is I'll use this as a centerpiece on an A2 size card. So I'll show you that later. Now, if you remember back to the inspiration photo, which you can see here, we had these grasses at the bottom of the inspiration photo, and I wanted to add those. The first thing that came to mind was the Gradient Sunset stamp set. It has those perfect grasses. It's almost identical, so perfect for this scene. And originally, I thought these would look great as kind of like some brown grasses. But I didn't like the look of that, so I decided to stamp over it with the Obsidian pigment ink. So you can see the brown grasses there. I just didn't feel like there was enough contrast to that, so I decided to make them a true silhouette and just make them black. Now, whenever you're stamping on watercolor paper, I do recommend that you use a stamp positioner such as a Misty so that you can stamp it more than once. The textured paper makes it difficult to get a clear stamp. Here I was being super lazy. I didn't want to clean my stamp in between, and I also didn't want to cut a mask or anything like that. I had a paper towel on my desk, so I just used that. So we've got that there. And then of course we need a sentiment. I chose a sentiment from the Sophisticated Wreath stamp set that reads, "Live every day like it's Saturday," which I think is such a great sentiment. And I will go ahead and stamp this twice as well. Here's the Sophisticated Wreath stamp set. And I'll use a sentiment from this set for the second card as well. All that's left is to add some silhouette birds, and so I'll stamp that with the Obsidian pigment ink as well. I initially stamped only 2 birds, and then I decided I wanted a third to break up the horizon line. So I add the third one later off screen. So I'm just going to tear off the bottom of this, and then I'll go ahead and pop this up with the Instant Dimension foam tape. So let me know down in the comments if a project like this inspires you to break out your watercolors and try some freehand watercolor, or are you more apt to watercolor stamped images? I really like the torn edges of the watercolor paper. I think that adds a nice touch, and I'm really pleased with how this card came out. For the next card, I thought this color palette would be great for the Color Bands die set and for a non-traditional rainbow. So I didn't bother showing you guys the watercoloring. I used the same colors that I used from the first card. And I basically just used the dies to kind of figure out where on these scraps of watercolor paper I needed to add the watercolor. So super simple. And then I'll just run these through the Mini Blossom die cut machine. Now, one thing that would be helpful is if you backed your pieces with some foam adhesive before you went ahead and die cut it. That way everything would die cut together. I forgot to do that, so what I'll do instead is I will just cut several pieces of white cardstock to lift these up and give them some dimension. But one of my favorite things to do is just go ahead and back the cardstock or the watercolor paper with foam tape or fun foam. I also recommend that you let your pieces dry before you die cut them to make sure that you get nice crisp edges when it goes through the die cut machine. Otherwise, if it's too soft, I feel like you get kind of squishy edges. It's not quite as sharp. So I have the Galactic Extreme die ink here, and I'm just going to stamp the second sentiment from the Sophisticated Wreath stamp set, which reads, "Always be a dreamer." I think the sentiments in this set are just so great. And I'm just going to tear the edges of both of these. So this was another scrap of watercolor paper. So definitely keep all your scraps, even the smallest pieces, because you can create sentiment strips like this. You can use them to test colors that you're mixing for a project. There's a lot of uses for even the smallest bits of scrap of watercolor paper, so make sure that you keep those. So I'll pop up the sentiment strip with the foam tape and also the rainbow, and I love this limited palette watercolor rainbow. I think I like it a lot more than a traditional rainbow. Thanks so much for joining me today for these limited palette watercolor cards. I'll see you soon with more inspiration.
Hello crafters, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you want to see more, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything. Thanks for watching!